Hey dude, tonight we're going back to a time when taking a bath wasn't relaxing. It was a straight-up chore. No hot water on demand. No fluffy towel. Just a wooden barrel, some boiled water if you were lucky, and the constant hope you wouldn't tip the whole thing over. Bathing in the 1700s wasn't about comfort, it was survival. You'd haul buckets from a well, heat water over fire, pour it in, then sit there knees to chest in murky water that cooled down way too fast. And if you were poor, you didn't even get your own bath. You shared it with your siblings, in the same water, one after the other. Tonight we're sinking into that weird, gritty corner of the past, the kind nobody talks about because, honestly, it wasn't pretty. But it's real. And sometimes real is what helps us slow down. Before we step into the barrel, hit that like button and subscribe if quiet, honest history helps calm your racing brain. And drop a comment, what time is it for you? And where are you listening from tonight? I always check. Now dim those lights, lay back, and if someone's next to you, just whisper, you would have gone last in the bath. If you're solo, you're not alone, I'm here too. Let's wash the day off together the old way, one cold bucket at a time. You're standing in a cramped kitchen, not the kind with tiles or stainless steel, but one that smells of soot, smoke, and stale broth. The floor is uneven stone. The window is a single pane of warped glass, the view outside obscured by decades of grime and the slow crawl of ivy. In the center of the room, a large wooden barrel rests on the floor, still slightly damp from the last time it was used. That's not for pickling or beer. That's your bathtub. Bathing in the 1700s wasn't an everyday affair. For many, it wasn't even a weekly one. The idea of a daily wash belonged only to the wealthiest households or those living near natural springs. For the average European family, especially in rural towns or even smaller cities, bathing was an ordeal of effort, heat, and logistics. To prepare a bath, someone, usually the woman of the house or a servant, had to heat water over an open fire, one heavy iron pot at a time. There were no indoor water heaters, no plumbing, no taps. Each kettle was boiled, then carefully poured into the wooden barrel, then another, and another. It took roughly 20 to 30 gallons of hot water to fill the barrel halfway. Cold water from a nearby well or rain barrel was added to temper the scalding heat. This alone could take well over an hour, and that's before a single toe touched the bath. You didn't get clean alone either, not always. Baths were often shared, either sequentially or in rare cases simultaneously, particularly among children. In poorer homes, one batch of water would be reused by multiple family members. The father bathed first, then the mother, then the children. By the time the youngest entered, the water was tepid, cloudy, and faintly grimy with the residue of everyone who had come before. That's where the phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," comes from. Yes, that was a real risk. Soap was not the fluffy, floral luxury we imagine today. In many places, it was a lard-based alkaline substance, homemade and harsh. It stung eyes, dried out skin, and left behind a faint smell of tallow and ash. Still, it was prized. Some made their own, others bartered for it, and a few went without. Hair, when washed, was treated with concoctions of herbs and vinegar, not commercial shampoos. If you had lice, and many did, you simply combed with hot oil and hoped. Privacy was another matter entirely. Few homes had a designated space for bathing. Most used the kitchen, which stayed warm because of the hearth. Curtains might be hung, but more often than not, modesty was sacrificed in favor of practicality. The faint crackle of firewood, the clink of iron kettles, and the smell of boiling water mixed with ash and candle wax became the sensory background of bathing. And when the bath was over, there were no towels as we know them. Coarse linens, worn shirts, or leftover scraps of fabric were used to dry off. Some simply air-dried, wrapping themselves in old cloaks or quilts near the fire. And the water, carried by hand, bucket by bucket, back outside, poured onto the ground into a ditch, or used to scrub the floor. It's easy to romanticize history. Wooden beams, handmade soap, hearthlit evenings. But the truth of daily life was colder, rougher, and often splintered. especially when you were trying to sit in a barrel not meant for comfort, hoping it didn't leak, crack, or collapse beneath you. This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about effort, ritual, survival. Bathing was an event, not a habit. And yet, people found small ways to take pride in it. A lavender sprig added to the water if you were lucky. A rare bar of imported soap gifted for a wedding. A mother humming while scrubbing behind her child's ears. Still, one has to wonder, did they truly feel clean after all that effort? Or was it simply a ritual to feel a little less like the world was closing in? The bathhouse, the boil, and the beliefs. Let's step outside the home for a moment, into the world of public bathing, where water, cleanliness, and community collided in unpredictable ways. While many families managed with the wooden barrel in their kitchen, towns and cities across Europe, and later, the colonies offered another option, the bathhouse. These weren't spas. They weren't elegant Roman ruins either. They were functional spaces, dark, humid, and often riddled with bacteria no one could yet name. In the early 1700s, the idea of germ theory hadn't yet reached the scientific world. Cleanliness, in the eyes of many, wasn't linked to health. In fact, bathing too often was seen by some as dangerous. The belief that water opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to illness was common. Still, bathhouses survived, even thrived, especially in larger European towns. For a small fee, a person could rent time in a shared wooden tub or soak in a communal pool. These houses often operated like informal clubs, where gossip, trade deals, and even political plans could be whispered over the sound of dripping steam. In places like France, some bathhouses grew elaborate, with divided rooms for men and women, basic heating systems, and even servants to help with scrubbing. In London, bathhouses ranged from quiet, modest buildings near the Thames to rowdier ones known as stews, which doubled as brothels, eventually leading to their decline by the late 18th century under moral and legal pressure. The hygiene was variable. Water might be changed once a day, or not. In some cases, bathers brought their own buckets of hot water to add to the tubs. In winter, ice crusted the walls and floors. In summer, the air reeked of sweat and mildew. Many bathers wore a light linen covering or nothing at all. Modesty, again, was secondary to warmth and function. But bathing wasn't just about the body. It was spiritual. In some traditions, washing symbolized renewal, washing away sin, not just grime. Religious rituals involving water were woven into everyday life. Mikvahs, ablutions, and ritual cleansings before worship. In these cases, the act of bathing had less to do with health and more to do with morality. Then there were the rural beliefs, what we might now call superstitions. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was said that bathing during certain moon phases could cause illness or miscarriage. In others, women were discouraged from bathing during menstruation or after childbirth due to the fear of letting cold in through the skin. Midwives sometimes advised against full-body washes, believing it could weaken the blood. But contrast this with other traditions, places where sweat baths, steam rooms, or heated stones were celebrated for their healing properties. In some Nordic and Slavic cultures, sauna traditions persisted even through hard winters. A world away from the English barrel, the Finnish or Russian bather was embracing the burn, rinsing sweat with cold water, striking their own backs with birch branches, and walking out invigorated. It's fascinating how ideas about water, something so basic, could vary so widely. In one region, bathing made you vulnerable. In another, it made you whole. By the mid-1700s, some progressive thinkers were starting to suspect that regular bathing might, in fact, be a good thing. A few physicians and writers began recommending more frequent washing, especially of hands and face. But these were the early murmurs of a revolution that wouldn't fully arrive until the 1800s. For most, bathing remained infrequent, difficult, and deeply personal. And yet there is something universal in it. The act of preparing, of lowering yourself into warm water, even just a half-filled barrel, offered a pause. A moment to step away from smoke-filled air, aching joints, or the clamor of livestock. To soak, breathe, and become, if only briefly, unburdened. But even as water became a source of brief comfort, the 1700s were teetering toward a shift. Cities were growing, disease was spreading, and the questions were multiplying. If water could make you clean, could it also make you sick? From wooden barrels to plumbing dreams. As the century turned and the 1700s stumbled toward their close, something began to shift. Quietly at first, then more forcefully, as cities grew bloated with people, and the consequences of poor sanitation became impossible to ignore. In urban areas like London, Paris, and Philadelphia, the stench of overcrowded housing, overflowing chamber pots, and stagnant water had become unbearable. The connection between cleanliness and health was still hazy, but the consequences of filth were everywhere. Typhus, cholera, plague, and endless childhood deaths. Physicians started to take notice. The idea that cleanliness might prevent disease was no longer radical. It was becoming necessary. And yet for most people, access to consistent washing remained out of reach. The wooden barrel was still there in the corner of the kitchen. It still leaked. It still took hours to fill. Most people still used it maybe once a month, if that. And public bathhouses. Many had shuddered under fears of immorality or because the water itself, never fully clean, became a source of infection. But technology was coming. Across wealthier European households, early plumbing systems were beginning to appear. Nothing close to what we know today, just crude channels and copper piping, designed to carry rainwater or stored water into a single room. Copper bathtubs lined in tin or zinc began replacing barrels in wealthier homes. These tubs weren't filled by turning a tap. They were still filled by servants carrying heavy buckets. But the idea of a designated bathing room was born. This was also the beginning of a shift in cultural ideals. Cleanliness started to represent not just health but morality. The Enlightenment had ushered in new ways of thinking about the body, the self, and one's place in society. Suddenly, being clean meant being respectable. To be unwashed was not just uncomfortable, it was considered indecent, even uncivilized. And so, those who could afford it bathed more often. Perfumed soaps, once rare, became more widely available. Towels, soft ones, made from cotton or linen, were sold in general stores. Newspapers ran advertisements for bathing solutions and pore-tightening powders. In larger estates, servants were hired specifically for bathing preparation. But in rural villages and among the working class, little changed. The bath barrel stayed. The water was still heated kettle by kettle, and the soap, if it came at all, still stung. Still, small changes crept in. Some towns experimented with public washrooms or traveling bath wagons, carts outfitted with tubs which could be rented by the hour. Others began to build shared pump houses, where neighbors could gather water more easily. And slowly, the conversation around hygiene began to include children, education, and even women's health, topics long ignored. It would still take decades, well into the 1800s, before indoor plumbing became widespread. But the foundation had been laid, the belief that bathing wasn't just a chore or a luxury. It was something everyone deserved. Looking back now, the wooden barrel seems almost cruel. Its splinters, its cold metal hoops, the labor it demanded, the sheer patience. But it was also a symbol of endurance, of adaptation, of the endless ways humans work with what they have. And even as the world moved forward, that image lingered. A woman bending over a kettle, steam rising in ribbons, a child being scrubbed behind the ears. It's easy to forget just how far we've come, until you remember what it took just to feel clean. So next time you turn a tap, or step into a hot shower, or wrap yourself in a towel that's soft and warm, consider this. Would you still do it if it took you 3 hours, a fire, a barrel, and a whole family waiting their turn? When socks were a luxury, laundry in the 18th century, the wash tub and the Wednesday ritual. Close your eyes and listen, not for silence, but for the sound of linen being beaten against a flat rock, the creak of wooden washboards, the soft grunts of women lifting heavy cloth, fingers reddened from lye, wrists aching from wringing water from coarse garments. This isn't the sound of luxury. It's the soundtrack of survival, because in the 1700s, laundry was labor. In most homes, Wednesday was wash day, not because it was convenient, but because it was the only day available in a week already consumed by gathering, cooking, mending, and making do. Washing clothes wasn't just a task. It was a ritual, long, exhausting, and often thankless. It began before sunrise and could stretch well past dusk. There was no detergent, no spin cycle, no warm, humming dryer waiting to tumble sheets into softness. Instead, laundry began with gathering water, just as it did with bathing. Buckets from a stream, barrels filled with rainwater, or pump handles cranked by hand. Once the water was collected, it was heated over a fire, kettle after kettle, and poured into a massive wooden wash tub, the centerpiece of every wash day. Now came the soap, and if you were lucky, it was homemade. Lye soap, created from wood ash and rendered animal fat, was common in rural areas. It burned cuts, cracked skin, and stung eyes. But it worked. Some added herbs like rosemary or lavender to mask the harsh scent. Others simply endured. The process began with soaking, garments left to sit in hot, soapy water to loosen dirt and oils. Then came scrubbing, using wooden paddles, scrub boards, or even river rocks. For particularly filthy items, men's breeches, woolen stockings, undergarments, a second or third round of scrubbing was often needed. The notion of delicate cycles didn't exist. Clothes were treated like stubborn stains to be conquered by brute force. Once scrubbed, the garments had to be rinsed, usually in clean, cold water poured into another tub or fetched fresh from a stream. Some families had access to bluing agents, a powder or liquid made with indigo or other dyes, to make white linens appear less yellowed. It didn't clean, but it helped maintain the illusion of purity. And then came wringing, twisting each article of clothing one by one to remove as much water as possible. This was physically punishing. Wringing thick linens or heavy woolen garments by hand was brutal on the joints. By midday, fingers were raw, shoulders burned, backs ached. The final step, drying, and it was just as labor-intensive. Clothes were pinned or tied to lines outdoors if the weather allowed. In winter, they were draped near hearths, over chairs, on banisters, any surface that offered warmth. But even in summer, drying took hours. In damp climates, days. Now pause and think, how many clothes did the average person have? For the working poor, one outfit, possibly two. A linen chemise, a woolen petticoat, a shirt, a pair of stockings if they were lucky. Socks were often knitted by hand, darned over and over again until they were more thread than cloth. Owning more than two pairs was considered a luxury. Linen, though common, was expensive. Wool was warmer but harder to clean. And cotton, still an emerging import, was costly and exotic. Because of this, clothing was layered not for fashion but for preservation. Undergarments were worn to absorb sweat and soil, protecting the outer layers from frequent washing. Washing faded fabric. It weakened stitches. It wore down valuable garments. So washing was minimized, and hygiene became a matter of strategic layering. This is why laundry wasn't done daily or weekly. Sometimes outer garments were cleaned once a season. Spot cleaning, a dab of vinegar or salt water on a stain, was far more common. Even bedding, which we now change weekly, was often aired out, beaten for dust, and left unwashed for weeks, even months. Yet despite the effort and the grime, people found rhythm in it. Children played near the wash lines. Women gossiped as they scrubbed. Songs were sung in time with the wringing of cloth. And when it was done, when garments flapped dry in the breeze or hung steaming near the fire, there was a kind of quiet pride. Laundry meant order. Clean sheets meant safety. A crisp chemise meant readiness for Sunday worship or market day or visitors. But there's a strange irony buried beneath all this work. If people owned so few garments, why did they work so hard to clean what they barely had? The stain, the status, and the social code of cleanliness. Let's shift from the wash tubs of modest homes to the stately manners of the elite, where laundry carried not just the weight of soap and water, but of status. In wealthier households of the 1700s, particularly in England, France, and parts of colonial America, laundry wasn't a chore performed by the homeowner. It was the realm of servants, and in large households, that task fell to an entire class of invisible hands, the laundresses. These were women, often young and unmarried, who worked behind the scenes below stairs and always close to heat, steam, and chemical fumes. A laundress's work was hot, dangerous, and surprisingly political. She handled the garments that defined the public image of her employers. A misjudged wash could ruin delicate muslin or shrink fine wool. An unremoved stain could tarnish a reputation. Because yes, clothing was read like a story. In polite society, what you wore wasn't just about fashion. It was a signal of hygiene, order, and wealth. Crisp linen cuffs, a smooth cravat, a spotless petticoat, these were not luxuries alone. They were proof that someone else had the time and labor to make you look clean. And so the laundress had to be part chemist, part detective. Wine stains required hot milk and dabbing with ashes. Ink called for vinegar and thyme. Grease responded to a chalk rub. And blood was a laundress's most stubborn enemy, requiring immediate cold water, then long soaks, then prayers. Starch, too, played a role in this theater of appearance. A perfectly starched ruffle or cap held shape, framed the face, and projected elegance. Starch was made from boiling wheat or rice, then carefully applied and pressed, often using irons heated over flame. Burn the cloth and you ruin days of labor. Leave it too damp and mold might take hold by morning. And still there was danger. Lye burns, boiler scalds, smoke inhalation. In cramped laundry rooms with no ventilation, many laundresses developed respiratory illness or suffered permanent scarring from their work. There were no uniforms, no protections, just long skirts, pinned sleeves, and the knowledge that your day would end with the stink of wet wool in your nose and blisters on your fingers. Meanwhile, those they served remained wrapped in comfort, changing outfits 2 or 3 times a day. Morning gowns, riding dresses, evening coats, nightshirts. Laundry in these homes was constant, rotating, unrelenting. The piles never ended. Still, the laundress was rarely seen. Outside the manor, among middle and lower classes, another figure emerged, the traveling washerwoman. She would haul a cart between households, offer her services for a fee, and carry soiled garments home to wash in her own copper kettle. It was a common job for widows or women with no land, and it offered just enough coin to buy bread, soap, and perhaps a second-hand shawl. But perhaps most fascinating is how laundry defined not just labor, but moral judgment. To appear dirty, unkempt, unwashed, wrinkled, was to risk social suspicion. Even among the poor, cleanliness became a marker of discipline. A well-scrubbed apron might hide a patched dress, but it spoke of a woman's pride. A boy with polished shoes and a clean collar was considered respectable, even if his trousers were thin. And in cities, the concept of public laundry days gave rise to entire social networks. In Paris, women gathered at the lavoirs, public washhouses built along the Seine or over freshwater canals. These were communal spaces, gossip hubs, rumor mills, places of laughter, argument, and shared burden. One woman scrubbed as another wrung. A third nursed a child at her hip while discussing prices at the butcher's stall. It was sweaty, loud, and deeply human. These washhouses weren't private, but they were vital. For many women, it was the only place they could speak freely, away from husbands, children, and the watchful eye of their employers. And perhaps it's there, among the steam and splashing, that we begin to see laundry not just as toil, but as resistance, as care, as proof of life persisting through soot and scarcity. But then here's a question. In a world where your worth was judged by the whiteness of your linen, how much of your time was spent scrubbing just to be seen as worthy? The drying line and the quiet revolution of clean. As the 1700s drew to a close, something subtle but powerful began to shift, not just in how people washed clothes, but in how they thought about cleanliness itself. In the early part of the century, laundry was functional, a task to prevent rot, to control lice, to reset garments worn to exhaustion. But by its end, especially in growing cities and rising merchant classes, laundry was becoming an idea, one tangled in hygiene, morality, and even nationalism. Governments began encouraging public cleanliness, not always through health campaigns, but through laws and taxes. Some towns imposed fines for hanging laundry in public view, seeing it as a mark of poverty or disorder. Others began building public washhouses to reduce illness among the working class, subtly admitting what science had yet to fully prove. Clean environments slowed disease. But there were deeper forces at play, particularly for women. Laundry was one of the few arenas where women controlled knowledge, space, and rhythm. Whether it was a baroness directing her maids or a rural wife boiling linens beside a smoke-stained hearth, laundry gave women a sense of domain. It taught chemistry without textbooks. It taught timing, judgment, resourcefulness. And it taught pride. For poor families, a line of clean shirts blowing in the breeze was a statement. We may be poor, but we are not defeated. Mothers taught daughters how to fold cloth just so, how to scrub the underside of sleeves, how to remove candle wax from church collars. These were acts of continuity, generational rituals passed down like inheritance. And there always were the socks. Hand-knitted, carefully patched, often mismatched by color but perfectly matched in love. A child's pair might take hours to knit and more to wash properly without unraveling the stitches. When socks tore beyond repair, they were repurposed, stuffed into shoes for warmth, used to polish brass, or wound into rags. Socks weren't just clothing, they were a marker. To own more than one pair suggested comfort. To wear none at all, especially in winter, was a quiet emblem of hardship. And yet, those without shoes still washed their shirts. Those without coats still boiled their linen. Cleanliness became a strange kind of dignity, available even when wealth was not. As the Industrial Revolution crept into the 19th century, new machines began appearing. Hand-cranked wringers, cast iron stoves, early washing drums. Soap was industrialized. Water in some cities was piped. But for most of the 18th century, laundry was still about the hands, the effort, the slow surrender of a full day for the promise of a fresh collar. And perhaps the most striking truth: laundry, for all its tedium and toil, was one of the few acts that touched everyone, from duchesses to scullery maids. No matter how fine the fabric or how rough the hands that washed it, everyone faced the same enemy: time, grime, and the endless return of dirt. So next time you toss a shirt into a machine, press a button and walk away. Remember that once, long ago, someone scrubbed that shirt's ancestor clean with nothing but lye, grit, and the strength of their fingers, just to feel human again. Dinner by candle wax, eating without refrigeration. The pantry, the salt, and the stomach that waited. You're standing in a narrow kitchen, stone floor beneath your feet, wooden shelves above, and the unmistakable scent of smoke, salt, and vinegar hanging in the air. There's no hum of a refrigerator, no rattle of plastic packaging, no cold metal shelves humming behind closed doors. In the 1700s, food didn't wait for you. You waited for it, and you fought to keep it from spoiling. Without refrigeration, feeding a family wasn't just cooking, it was strategy, science, and survival. Everything spoiled: meat, milk, bread, even clean water if left too long. Insects were constant, mice inevitable, and yet somehow food made it to the table, often cold, often bland, but there. And that fact alone was a daily victory. Let's begin in the pantry, which wasn't just a storage closet. It was a sacred space, a cool, dark corner of the home where the season's labor hung in jars, sacks, and barrels. Root vegetables, carrots, onions, potatoes, were stored in earthen crocks or buried in sand to keep them dry and cool. Fruits were boiled into preserves or baked into long-lasting pies. Flour was sifted and stored in wooden bins, covered with linen to keep weevils out. And the meat. Meat was a battlefield. Fresh meat spoiled in hours, especially in summer, so people preserved it however they could. Salting was the most common method, pork and fish packed in layers of coarse salt inside wooden barrels, sometimes buried underground or kept in the coldest part of a stone cellar. The salt drew out moisture and slowed decay, but it also hardened the flesh and demanded long soaking before it could be cooked. Other methods included smoking, where meat was hung above a fire for days to absorb both heat and smoke, sealing its surface in a layer of char and flavor. In parts of Europe, pickling meat in brine or vinegar was also practiced, especially in seafaring towns. Dairy, too, had its own short clock. Milk went sour in a day, so it was quickly churned into butter or curdled into cheese, which kept longer. But even cheese had to be stored carefully, away from rats, flies, and damp. And bread, the very staple of the diet, was baked hard, not soft. It wasn't supposed to be fluffy and tender. It was supposed to last. That's why so much 18th century bread seems nearly inedible to modern teeth. It had to resist mold, endure storage, and stretch across days. People often soaked stale bread in broth or ale to soften it. Some even sliced it thin and toasted it dry again, creating what we now call rusks. This wasn't about taste. It was about making food last one more day. Now imagine preparing a dinner for your family with these limitations. No fridge to keep meat fresh. No freezer to preserve last night's stew. Vegetables wilted. Milk soured. And still, dinner had to appear. Meals were often a reflection of time. Whatever was closest to spoiling would be cooked first. That meant meals were often predictable: hearty stews, heavy breads, preserved meat, and small portions of whatever fruit had survived. Spices were rare and expensive, but those who had them used them generously, not for taste alone, but to mask decay. Even water wasn't always safe. In crowded towns, it could carry disease. Many turned to small beer, a weak ale brewed at home, low in alcohol but safer than questionable well water. Tea was rising in popularity, especially in England and its colonies, but that required fuel to boil the water, another precious resource. In this world, the act of feeding someone wasn't just domestic care. It was a calculation, a defense against hunger, against rot, against time. And when food did make it to the table, the setting was humble: a shared plate, a wooden spoon, a slice of bread used to scoop up broth or wipe the dish clean. Candles flickered low, not for ambience, but because firewood was limited and light was brief. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, eating fast before the dark set in. There was gratitude, but there was also vigilance. Because when food could turn on you overnight, how much could you truly trust what was on your plate? The preservers, the pests, and the price of waste. Let's step outside the kitchen into the garden, the smokehouse, and the barn. In the 1700s, food wasn't just cooked. It was captured, grown, guarded, and salvaged. And every stage of its life, from soil to shelf, was vulnerable to something. Start with the garden. Nearly every household, no matter how poor, tried to grow something edible. Turnips, beets, cabbages, leeks, whatever could withstand temperature swings and poor soil. These weren't garden beds trimmed in brick or lined with tags. They were clumps of earth behind the house, fenced off with sticks or rope and tilled by hand. And the enemies: pests, rabbits, slugs, birds, worms, but also weather, mold, disease, and sheer bad luck. One unexpected frost and the whole crop might be lost, which is why families grew more than they needed, if they could, because preserving the harvest wasn't just useful, it was survival insurance. Preservation was both art and labor. Herbs were tied into bundles and dried near the hearth. Apples were sliced and laid on racks near the windows to air dry. Root vegetables were buried in sandboxes. Grains were stored in tightly sealed bins. And still, mice found ways in. Weevils laid eggs in the flour. Spores bloomed in the jams. And rats? Rats were an everyday threat, capable of chewing through wood, linen, even stone. That's why every food store was accompanied by a plan to keep something else out. Cats, traps, hanging baskets, iron latches. Children were scolded for leaving a lid off. Servants were dismissed for wasting a jar of pickled eggs. One slip and months of food could vanish in hours. And then there was the meat house or smokehouse if a family was lucky enough to have one. Meat hung from beams, strips of salted pork, smoked sausage, or dried fish wrapped in cloth. The smell was pungent, ashy, greasy, but it meant security. Even a single ham could stretch across weeks if rationed carefully. But preservation wasn't just for the home. In larger towns, markets operated around preservation. Sellers hawked goods that traveled well: wheels of cheese, sacks of oats, dried beans, smoked herring. Shoppers learned how to sniff out spoiled food, how to press the rind of cheese for rot, how to check a barrel of pickles for sourness. Wasting food, whether at home or market, wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Because hunger, for most, was never far away. Even among wealthier families, leftover bones were boiled twice, first for soup, then for broth. Stale bread became stuffing. Wilting vegetables were chopped fine and cooked into pies. Fruit on the edge of rotting was mashed into spreads or baked into tarts. Every scrap had a second life. Food waste was a modern luxury. Back then, it was a moral failure. This frugality extended to how people ate. Most meals were simple: a slice of bread with salt, porridge with onions, a small piece of meat shared between five. Seasonality wasn't a lifestyle trend, it was a law. You ate what was ready. When the apples were gone, they were gone. When the beans sprouted, you ate them before the worms did. People adjusted their appetites around the calendar, not the menu. And so dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a marker that you had enough, that you planned wisely, that the pickles hadn't spoiled and the ham hadn't been stolen and the root cellar hadn't flooded. It was evidence that you had bent time and nature, just enough, to keep your family fed for one more night. But even with all that care, all that ingenuity, one question lingered in the back of every mind. If the meat smells fine, if the bread looks clean, how do you really know it's safe? The feast, the famine, and the slow dawn of preservation. The 1700s weren't just about scraping by with the seasons. As the century neared its close, new methods of preservation were beginning to emerge, quietly shaping the world that would soon arrive, the world of industrialization, refrigeration, and convenience. But in the heart of the century, before ice boxes and tin cans, families still lived on the edge of uncertainty, a reality that shaped how they ate, how they celebrated, and how they mourned. A winter's feast could be followed by a week of boiled potatoes and salt pork. A year of plenty was always at risk of giving way to famine. Yet for all the hardships, there were moments of triumph, when harvests were plentiful, when food seemed endless, or when family came together to celebrate survival. The Thanksgiving-like feasts, called harvest dinners, were the one time in the year when a bounty appeared on the table. Meats roasted whole, breads so fresh the steam rose from them like smoke, and fruits glistening in the dim light. But even these feasts had their roots in frugality. They celebrated not just abundance, but the survival of abundance. These meals were long and slow, with hours of chewing and digesting, and often stretched into late-night conversations by candlelight, where families shared stories, reminisced about the years past, and planned for the coming months. And after the feast, the leftovers, what little remained, were carefully preserved or eaten in the days that followed. Leftover pie wasn't just dessert, it was hope. The bread pudding the day after Christmas wasn't indulgence, it was resourcefulness. These were meals created to last not just for the evening, but for the future. But food was always fleeting. As much as people worked, as much as they preserved, famine still loomed. The fear of it was a shadow that followed every meal. And in a time before reliable communication, the early warning signs of hunger were often invisible until it was too late. Wilted crops, barren wells, or the sudden absence of seasonal foods. There was always the threat of bad weather, of disease, of the unpredictable forces of nature that could strike and bring entire families to their knees. As early as the mid-1700s, some of the wealthier nations began experimenting with early forms of canning, though the technology was crude and unrefined. The idea of preserving food in jars, sealed with wax, had existed for centuries, but the early metal cans invented in France and England were expensive and impractical for most. The first commercial canning factories didn't come into being until the early 1800s, yet the groundwork was being laid during the 1700s. Preservation through freezing was a distant dream. The idea of storing food in refrigerated environments was far beyond the imagination of most. And yet, these ideas, and the lives that were changed by them, had already begun to take shape in the minds of inventors and dreamers. But in the moment, for families across Europe and the colonies, life continued to revolve around the simple and often dangerous rituals of food preservation. The salt, the smoke, the vinegar, the careful planning of what to eat first before it spoiled. These rituals were as much a part of daily life as the rising sun, and they marked the passage of time with each season. In fact, time itself was the ultimate preservative. Food, at its most basic, was just time held in place. When a farmer dug into his root cellar for onions, or a mother unwrapped a cloth bundle of meat hanging by the fire, what she was holding wasn't just food. She was holding the echoes of months of labor, the preservation of life, and the uncertain passage of time. And perhaps in that way, food in the 1700s was the true gift, a symbol of survival, ingenuity, and a deep, intimate connection to the land. It wasn't just about what you ate, but how you ate it, and what it meant to make it through to the next meal. That slow, deliberate connection to food, the work, the preservation, the care, was a way of living, an ethos that has been lost in the speed of the modern world. Now when we walk into a supermarket, we forget just how far we've come, how far humanity has stretched the limits of what is possible. And yet, each of those cans, each box, each frozen dinner still carries the same weight of effort. When you're handed a meal today, fresh, chilled, or preserved in some modern way, pause for a moment and ask yourself, what would it take, even now, to make sure you had enough to eat tomorrow? The itch you couldn't scratch, living with lice in colonial Europe. The unseen enemy and the persistent itch. You're sitting in a humble wooden chair, the heat of the hearth flickering over your shoulder. The air smells of wet wool, smoke, and the lingering aroma of bread. But there's something else, something that gnaws at your peace, an itch. At first it's faint, an innocent sensation that can be ignored, but it grows. The small, sharp scratch behind your ear, the tugging at your collar as your skin seems to crawl beneath the fabric, the unshakable, nagging sensation that something is living there, just beneath the surface. Lice. In the 1700s, the concept of hygiene as we know it was still in its infancy. While some people took pride in cleanliness, most simply did the best they could. But without access to the kinds of cleaning agents we take for granted, lice, tiny, nearly invisible parasites that thrived in hair and clothing, were a constant part of life. Lice didn't discriminate. They didn't care if you were royalty or a commoner. They were as inevitable as the rising sun, and they thrived in the thick, oily hair of men, women, and children alike. The living conditions of the time, damp houses, crowded spaces, shared beds, created the perfect breeding ground for these pests. In fact, most people in the 1700s spent a significant portion of their day dealing with lice. Whether you were a soldier, a servant, or a noblewoman, chances are you were actively combing your hair or scratching at your scalp throughout the day. There was no shampoo, No lice treatments, no sprays or medicinal oils. Instead, people resorted to primitive remedies, often ineffective and harsh. Ashes, vinegar, and even boiling water were used to try and kill the lice and their eggs. But without the understanding of how these creatures lived, it was often a never-ending battle. When lice appeared, families would gather together for a ritual of nitpicking. Children and adults would sit around the fire while mothers or servants carefully combed through hair with fine-toothed combs, pulling out lice and their eggs, known as nits. This process could take hours. The comb would catch on knots and tangles, and the work was tedious, but essential for survival. There were few ways to escape the infestation. Even the wealthier classes were plagued by lice, often in their wigs. Wigs were worn by those in the upper echelons of society, and these wigs, which could be made from human hair or animal fur, would become a haven for lice. And so, the rich would often have their wigs cleaned with powders or heated in a box to kill the pests, though this was no guarantee of success. The itchy, nagging presence of lice would remain. But lice weren't just a nuisance, they were a health hazard. Lice could carry diseases, and they were a major cause of typhus, especially in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. When soldiers returned from battle, or when people traveled through crowded towns and villages, they often carried lice with them. These creatures, which were typically ignored in daily life, were actually vectors of disease that could ravage entire populations. For many, dealing with lice wasn't just about the itching. It was about survival. Scratching your head could lead to open sores, which became a breeding ground for infection. As lice carried diseases, one scratch could potentially introduce deadly bacteria into the bloodstream. But for most people in the 1700s, the connection between lice and disease was well understood. They simply accepted lice as part of life, a difficult but enduring reality. Even the basic act of washing clothes to remove lice was a monumental task. Clothes were soaked in vinegar or boiled, but even then, it was not always effective. Many people couldn't afford to wash their clothes frequently, so the lice remained, nesting in seams and folds. In the wealthier households, where servants or even ladies' maids were tasked with combing out the lice and maintaining the cleanliness of clothing and wigs, there was an underlying sense of shame if lice were discovered. Despite their wealth, the presence of lice was considered a sign of neglect, and it was feared that lice infestation could damage a family's reputation. But it wasn't just about the physical presence of the pests. It was about how lice became an embodiment of society's disregard for basic hygiene. It was a reminder of the hardships of daily life, of the things you couldn't control, even when you tried your best. And so, in the midst of all the scratching and picking, there was a quiet question that lingered in the background. In a world where lice could be so pervasive, how did anyone ever feel truly clean? The rituals, the remedies, and the suffering. As the days stretched on and the itch intensified, it became clear. Lice weren't just a nuisance, they were a daily struggle, a part of the rhythm of life. And the rituals that emerged to deal with them were as embedded in daily life as the sunrise. If you lived in the countryside, you might have had access to some degree of fresh water, but in towns and cities, the water was often filthy, used by everyone for every purpose. Even in wealthier homes, water was stored in rain barrels, and the same water that cleaned the dishes or watered the plants was used to wash the hands. The idea of sanitation didn't exist in the way we understand it today. A bath was a luxury, especially in winter when fires burned through the night and water had to be heated by hand. Lice, therefore, were bound to thrive. The most common remedy was to shave the head, or at least cut the hair as short as possible. For women, especially those of the working class, this was a difficult decision. Hair was often seen as a symbol of femininity and beauty, but it was a practical necessity. A close-shorn head meant fewer places for lice to hide and a much easier target for combing. Shaving, however, wasn't always a complete solution. The lice could return. especially if the hair wasn't carefully maintained or if the hair was allowed to grow back out. In wealthier homes, where wigs were a fashionable statement, the lice problem was even more complicated. Wigs, often made from the hair of poor children or adults, would require special care. They were powdered to reduce the smell of oils and sweat, and to keep the lice at bay. But no amount of powdering or styling could prevent the tiny, persistent insects from taking residence in the wig's folds. The wealthier, who relied on wigs to maintain an air of dignity, were often more afflicted by lice than they cared to admit. For those without the means to shave or buy new wigs, or for those with a deep social stigma against cleanliness issues, the most common practice was combating lice with oils and unproven herbal remedies. In some cultures, people used sulfur, rubbing it into their hair and skin, believing it could kill the lice. Others turned to herbs such as lavender or rosemary, using them in attempts to mask the smell of unwashed hair or in hopes that the scent would repel the pests. Lice combs, fine-toothed and sharp, became indispensable tools. Women would sit for hours, meticulously combing through their family's hair, removing lice, nits, and any debris trapped in the tangles. This task was often performed in the evening around the hearth, where there was light and warmth. It became a family ritual, though a deeply uncomfortable one. Children cried from the pain of having the lice picked from their heads, and adults winced as they felt the sharp teeth of the comb scrape against their scalps. In the absence of modern science, people often turned to beliefs and superstitions to explain the lice. In some places, it was said that a person could only get lice if they had been bewitched, cursed by someone's jealousy or spite. Others believed that lice were a punishment from God for moral failings, a sign of impurity that needed to be cleansed. These beliefs, often rooted in a combination of folklore and religion, added to the psychological toll of living with lice. The pestilence wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, a mark of something unseen but ever-present, as insidious as sin itself. Those with the means might purchase ointments from apothecaries, ointments made from herbs, animal fat, or the much sought-after mercury. These potions were intended to kill lice, but were far more dangerous than the pests themselves. Mercury could burn the skin, causing severe irritation, and could even lead to mercury poisoning with prolonged use. In a world without effective treatments, the lice problem wasn't something easily escaped. It became a part of life, something you endured, something you managed, like hunger, cold, or poverty. Yet even in this discomfort, there were those who found ways to embrace the inevitable. Rituals, however unpleasant, brought togetherness. Families found solidarity in the shared experience of removing lice. Communities helped one another, advising remedies, sharing combs, and providing the care of a well-loved hand. But amid it all, there was an undeniable question that haunted the existence of every person, from the poorest servant to the richest noble. In a world where lice could so easily invade the most private parts of your body, how could you ever truly escape their constant presence? Was cleanliness ever possible, or were humans forever meant to endure the gnawing, crawling itch? The legacy of lice and the shifting tide of hygiene. As the years passed and the 1700s faded into the 1800s, something began to change, albeit slowly. The concept of cleanliness, once relegated to the fringes of life, was beginning to creep into the center of public consciousness. Slowly, the grinding reality of lice and filth was met with the early whispers of public health reforms, and more importantly, the beginnings of scientific understanding. But for now, in the 1700s, lice remained the unseen enemy, always lurking, always a constant reminder of the limitations of their world. Even when the nobility adopted new methods of personal care, like the frequent changing of wigs or washing their garments in vinegar and boiling water, they were far from free of the ever-present threat of lice. The humble lives of the working poor, however, continued to rely on the same old techniques, combing, scraping, and suffocating lice with whatever they could manage: ashes, sulfur, olive oil. There was no recourse from the grinding repetition of this battle. Every day was spent fighting something invisible, unseen by the naked eye but constant nonetheless. It was a battle waged not with weapons, but with patience, with hours of combing, with calloused fingers. Yet despite the effort, the results were far from guaranteed. Even the wealthiest of Europe's elite in their most lavish homes could not entirely escape the grip of these pests. At the height of fashion, elaborate powdered wigs could house hundreds of lice, hidden beneath layers of perfume, powders, and hairspray. The nobility, in their pursuit of grandeur and ostentation, were not immune. They were simply better at hiding it. Their lice problem was one not of discomfort, but of appearance, an issue of social and public image. Still, as the 18th century progressed, the conversation around cleanliness began to change. The Enlightenment ushered in not just new ideas about governance and society, but also ideas about the human body, hygiene, and the importance of public health. In places like Paris, intellectuals and scientists began asking new questions. Could there be a link between lice and disease? Could hygiene practices prevent the spread of pestilence? But these questions were more philosophical than practical. People were still fighting the same battle in their daily lives. For most, lice were simply accepted as an inevitable nuisance. They were part of life, woven into the very fabric of existence. And yet, even in the absence of modern knowledge, there were small shifts in the way people approached their personal health. The earliest public bathhouses began to appear, although they were often just as much places of socialization as they were of cleanliness. But they marked the beginning of something, an awareness that hygiene could be something more than just a private concern. The legacy of lice, though invisible in the modern world, carried with it a profound reminder of human vulnerability, how disease, filth, and poverty shaped history, often in ways that were too small, too insidious to notice until it was too late. And in the 1700s, lice served as a metaphor for something larger: the fragility of life, the dangers of neglect, and the battle against the elements. It's easy to dismiss lice as just a nuisance, but for those who lived with them daily, they represented something much deeper, an expression of the enduring struggle against a world that was, for the most part, indifferent to the human condition. A battle fought in silence, in private corners of homes, in the midst of work, toil, and survival. So as we look back now, with the comforts of modern medicine, shampoo, and pest control, we might ask ourselves, how much of history is defined by the tiny, invisible forces that shaped lives in ways we can't even feel? And what might we be enduring today that will only be recognized tomorrow? A spoonful of lead, everyday toxicity before plumbing, the dangers beneath the surface. Imagine a time when food didn't come from sterile, brightly lit stores, where the process of cooking was something much deeper, and what was on your plate was often the result of generations of tradition, innovation, and sometimes danger. Now, take a moment and consider the vessels used to prepare that food. The pots, the utensils, the plates. You sit down to a hearty meal, perhaps a roast, some vegetables, and a thick stew. Your meal is served on beautiful plates, perhaps handed down for generations. The golden brown crust of the bread is flaky, the butter fresh, and the wine poured generously. The food looks fresh, the aroma is inviting, and yet beneath the surface there's something sinister, a danger no one yet understands. Lead. In the 1700s, people cooked and ate from pots, pans, and utensils that were often made with lead. The same metal that would later be recognized for its toxicity was in everything, from the pewter plates used in wealthier homes to the wine casks lined with lead for preservation. People had no idea that lead, when ingested over time, would slowly poison the body. What seemed like useful material, often chosen for its malleability and strength, was actually the quiet architect of numerous ailments and even death. Lead poisoning was not an immediate concern. It didn't cause the dramatic symptoms we might associate with more direct toxins. Instead, it caused a slow, creeping decline in health. Abdominal pain, fatigue, and memory loss were some of the first signs. It was only after years of exposure, when people had consumed enough wine, eaten enough food off lead-lined dishes, or worked with lead-soldered cans that the damage became apparent. But the signs were so subtle that many didn't even recognize them as related to their everyday environment. A housewife might be serving dinner on pewter plates, mistaking the shine of lead for the elegance of silver, and never suspect that those plates were leaching lead into the food. Even drinking from a lead-based goblet could expose a person to harmful levels of the metal. And then there was the wine, perhaps the most insidious culprit of all. In some cultures, wine was stored in lead-lined casks, a process that not only preserved the beverage but was also thought to enhance its flavor. Lead acetate, often referred to as sugar of lead, was used to sweeten wine, making it more palatable for those who had access to better goods. What was once a simple pleasure became a toxic indulgence. For centuries, the nobility and wealthy classes drank wine that contained lead compounds, unaware that they were slowly poisoning themselves with every glass. In wealthier homes, plumbing also carried its risks. Pipes were made of lead, and water, often stored for long periods in lead-lined containers, was contaminated before it even made it to the table. Lead pipes were used to carry water from the city's public fountains into private homes, feeding kitchens, baths, and even drinking wells. This practice, too, unknowingly introduced toxic levels of lead into everyday life. But even beyond lead, the idea of toxicity in food was all around. Mercury, too, was used in medicine, in cosmetics, and even in food preservation methods. The innocent appearance of a colorful syrup or a new medicinal concoction might hide deadly compounds inside. Toxicity wasn't just limited to heavy metals. It stretched into every aspect of daily life. The same people who washed with mercury-infused soaps, who ate from lead-encrusted bowls, likely had no idea that their seemingly harmless, everyday rituals were bringing them closer to disease. Yet it wasn't only the wealthy who were affected. The lower classes, who didn't have access to the fine porcelain and pewter of the rich, often used wooden spoons, clay bowls, and simple metal containers, which in many cases were covered in arsenic-based paints or improperly fired, leaching toxins from the material itself. And still, no one understood the connection between these everyday objects, so ingrained in their world, and the slow accumulation of harm was far beyond the reach of the people of the time. The hidden dangers of domestic life. As the 1700s wore on, life remained a balance of innovation and ignorance. Despite their proximity to toxins, people in the 1700s were deeply attuned to the rhythms of life, seasonal crops, food preservation methods, and the simple pleasure of a well-cooked meal. Yet beneath all this, many were unknowingly living with the consequences of unsafe practices, ones that had far-reaching effects on their bodies. Take the painted ceramics that adorned many kitchens, particularly in wealthier homes. The bright, colorful patterns, so prized for their aesthetic appeal, were often created using arsenic-based pigments. Green, in particular, was a common color for decorative items like plates, teapots, and bowls. This pigment, called Scheele's green, was a beautiful shade, but it was made using arsenic, a highly toxic substance. While people admired the designs, they were unknowingly ingesting tiny amounts of arsenic over time. Arsenic poisoning, like lead poisoning, often didn't present itself immediately. Symptoms could range from headaches and vomiting to more severe chronic issues like liver damage and skin lesions. Yet, because arsenic was used so widely in both food storage and home decor, people didn't recognize it as a potential source of illness. To the average person, these brightly colored ceramics were nothing more than fashionable, everyday items, evidence of good taste, not silent killers. And in larger cities, where streets were filled with human and animal waste, the toxins were even more pervasive. Without plumbing to dispose of waste properly, human sewage often contaminated the water supply, leading to diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. In many cases, lead pipes carried water directly to kitchens, where families drank, cooked, and bathed in water that was, in essence, already tainted with the risk of disease. Water was stored in cisterns, often uncovered, leading to further contamination by debris, pests, and bacteria. While we associate sanitation with cleanliness today, the 1700s had no such concept. People often relied on local rivers, wells, and public fountains to access water, without any knowledge of bacterial contamination or the concept of pathogens. These public water sources often became breeding grounds for disease, as well as an inadvertent vector for the toxins from lead pipes and polluted surroundings. The water was not safe. And even as people tried to purify their water by boiling it, the impact of previous contamination lingered, still unseen. This lack of knowledge about toxins didn't only affect food and water, it also extended into medical practices. For instance, mercury was widely used as a treatment for a variety of ailments, including syphilis. The highly toxic substance was often ingested in small doses, with the belief that it would cure the disease. While it did have some medicinal properties, its side effects were profound. Mercury poisoning led to tremors, gums bleeding, and neuropsychiatric symptoms. Yet, physicians at the time had no idea how dangerous mercury could be when used in high doses or over long periods. But mercury wasn't just confined to the world of medicine. In some regions, mercury was also used in cosmetics, particularly in face powders, which were often made with a combination of mercury and lead to lighten the skin. The pursuit of beauty, ironically, came with a price. These powders slowly poisoned the skin, leading to hair loss, disfigurement, and even death. Women, in particular, were among the primary consumers of such beauty products, unaware of the toxins they were applying directly to their faces. Even in the kitchen, the need for preservation of food created further risk. For example, food was sometimes preserved in glazed ceramics, which often contained toxic glazes made with lead. Lead was a cheap and durable material for making containers, but over time, it would leach into the food stored within. And once again, no one made the connection between food stored in these containers and the illnesses that plagued families. This was a common and deadly oversight, where the very containers used to keep food from spoiling were, in fact, causing long-term harm. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the practice of wine aging in lead-lined casks. In some countries, wine was stored in lead-lined barrels to preserve its sweetness. The sugar of lead, a compound of lead acetate, was even used to sweeten wine, but it also dissolved into the beverage, creating a silent poison that was consumed over time. Many wealthy families who enjoyed the finest wine were unknowingly drinking lead-tainted liquid. So, as people dined on what appeared to be delicious, nutritious meals, they were simultaneously ingesting toxins that would gradually deteriorate their health. It wasn't just the physical toll, it was the emotional toll too. Families had no idea that the beautiful plates, the rich wine, and the food they ate in abundance were contributing to their eventual decline. In fact, it wasn't until the 19th century that the link between lead poisoning, mercury toxicity, and disease began to be understood. By then, many of these practices were already ingrained in the culture. In essence, every meal was a gamble. A beautiful dish could conceal a deadly secret. The quiet revolution of safety and the birth of modern hygiene. As the 18th century drew to a close and the 19th century began, the world was on the cusp of monumental change. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping everything from production to living standards, and with it came a new understanding of health, safety, and cleanliness. But before the sanitary systems we take for granted today, the toxic legacy of the past wasn't easily erased. Even as the scientific community began to grasp the harmful effects of substances like lead, mercury, and arsenic, much of society was still unknowingly consuming these toxins. Change would come slowly, but the seeds were being planted for the hygienic revolution that would eventually lead to safer living conditions. In the early 19th century, the idea that public health and sanitation were important took root in the minds of both physicians and public officials. Louis Pasteur, whose work on germ theory would revolutionize medical practices, was still a few decades away from his discoveries, but there were early signs of progress. People started to question old practices and demand better understanding of how chemicals and substances affected the body. One of the most significant breakthroughs came in the form of public health laws and the regulation of food safety. Governments in Europe and the United States began to take measures to control food adulteration, and new laws were passed to ensure that food products were safe for consumption. While the methods weren't perfect, it marked the beginning of a new era of accountability, where the dangers of toxins were finally acknowledged, if not fully understood. This was also the time when the use of lead pipes began to be questioned. It was discovered that lead was not only affecting drinking water, but also causing lead poisoning when consumed regularly. Slowly, the shift toward copper pipes and other safer materials began, though it took time to implement these changes on a large scale. For the first time, public health became a matter of city planning. Sewers were built, fresh water became more accessible, and waste was treated with more consideration. The days of relying on lead and mercury to preserve, protect, and beautify began to fade, though their traces would remain in the lives of those who had lived with their toxic effects. Even as society moved toward these improvements, people continued to live with the lingering health consequences of the past century. Those who had grown up drinking lead-tainted wine or eating off pewter plates were experiencing the long-term effects. It's estimated that thousands of people died each year from the effects of lead poisoning, but because these illnesses were often chronic and presented with vague symptoms, they were not properly diagnosed. It wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that the scientific community would make the connection between lead poisoning and disease clear, leading to more strict regulations on the use of lead in products. The banning of lead in household goods and the shift away from toxic preservation methods were slowly put into effect, marking a turning point in the development of modern hygiene standards. In the world of medicine, mercury was also beginning to lose its appeal. As modern chemistry advanced and medical research focused more on the harmful effects of toxic substances, mercury began to be replaced with safer alternatives in medicine and cosmetics. However, it would take until the 20th century before the widespread use of toxic substances like mercury and lead in consumer goods would come to an end. In a way, the industrial and scientific advances of the 19th century marked the beginning of the end for the toxic practices that had ruled daily life for centuries. Yet, this wasn't just about cleaner products or safer materials. It was about a fundamental shift in how humans viewed their relationship with the environment, their bodies, and what they consumed. The conversation about toxicity was just beginning, and it would continue to evolve as technology advanced. And as we look back, we are left with an important reminder. We are only beginning to understand the impact of the past on our present. We might no longer live with lead pipes or arsenic-laden wine, but the pursuit of safety, health, and hygiene is ongoing. Even now, in our modern world, there are still substances and practices that might be silently harming us, just as lead and mercury silently harmed those who came before us. So as you sit down for a meal today, consider how far we've come, and ask yourself, what dangers, hidden in plain sight, will our descendants one day uncover in our own age? How to sleep in a shared bed with 4 strangers. The night bed and the struggle for space. It's late, the air is cool, and the shadows of the night are settling into the corners of the room. The fire that had warmed the hearth has burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the outlines of the room. In the corner near the wall, a large bed takes center stage, a bed that has room for more than one. But this isn't your own bed. This isn't even a family bed. This is a public bed, a shared space. You're not alone, and you won't be until morning. Across the centuries, the bedroom was the epicenter of intimacy, but for many, it was a place of necessity rather than comfort. In the 1700s, especially in the homes of the poor or the working class, space was limited. Housing was cramped, with multiple families often sharing a single room, and that room typically housed the bed, which was not just for the nuclear family. Beds were shared, often by strangers, because in a world of limited space and resources, privacy wasn't the luxury it is today. For those of the working class, it wasn't uncommon to see 5 or 6 people in a single bed: parents, children, apprentices, or even lodgers. You didn't own a bed in the way we think of ownership today. Beds were communal, not personal. They were where you slept, yes, but also where you rested after a long day of work, where you ate, where you talked, and sometimes where you dreamed. So, how do you sleep in a bed with 4 strangers? First, the bed itself. It's large, perhaps covered with a thick woolen blanket and a few old, lumpy pillows, but there's not much softness. The mattress might be stuffed with straw, feathers, or even grass, offering little relief from the hard, cold wood beneath. You share the space with strangers, some snoring, some tossing and turning, the warmth of their bodies radiating next to yours. Everyone is trying to find their corner, but the space is tight. But the bed isn't just for sleeping. It's where people rest after a day of work, where meals are sometimes shared, and where chores are caught up. It is the central hub of the household, the only place where you can be still after the hard labor of the day. Now, imagine the strangers. In wealthier homes, there might be private chambers for a guest, but in the working class, it's common to have lodgers, sometimes friends, sometimes strangers from nearby towns or villages. The lodging fee is cheap, but the cost is paid in personal space. Strangers might be family, or they might be travelers or apprentices, those who have come to work for a time and seek shelter in the same space. You don't get to decide who you share the bed with, nor can you leave if it's uncomfortable. You sleep next to these strangers out of necessity. There is a constant battle for space. Who gets the warmest corner, who has the best pillow? Often, there's an unspoken agreement about who gets to lie down first, usually the oldest or the youngest. Everyone fights for position, tucking blankets over themselves and shifting as others roll over in their sleep. Yet it's not just about physical space. The emotional aspect of sharing a bed with strangers is also part of the experience. It's an intimate, vulnerable space, even if it's crowded and uncomfortable. People hear each other's breathing, feel each other's warmth, and sometimes hear whispers or complaints in the dark. Silence falls when it's time to sleep, but there's always the tension of proximity, the closeness, the discomfort, and the awareness that personal space is a luxury. In some ways, it brings people together. People share stories, sometimes late into the night, while others sleep soundly through the chatter. And yet, it's also a reminder that comfort is often an illusion. You don't get to choose who shares your space or when you have time to yourself. Privacy is a foreign concept when your bed is the only place that can accommodate your entire world. Even in the coldest winter nights, when the wind howls outside and the room feels chilled to the bone, there's warmth to be found. But that warmth doesn't always come from the blanket. Sometimes, it comes from the shared experience of enduring discomfort together, where the laughter, the whispers, the silent presence of another human being provides more solace than the softness of the mattress. In a world where space is limited, and privacy is a luxury few can afford, the shared bed is a constant reminder of community, necessity, and the boundaries between comfort and survival. But as you try to drift off, there's one thought that lingers in the back of your mind. In a world where privacy is limited, how much of yourself can you truly share with others? The rituals, the discomfort, and the hidden intimacy. As the night deepens, the sounds of the world outside seem to fade. The cold stone walls of the room are a silent witness to the shared discomfort. But in the darkness, beneath the scratchy wool blankets, there is something else, a kind of unspoken rhythm, a pattern of coexistence that binds everyone together in that single, crowded bed. In a society where privacy was a rare luxury, every family, every community had to adapt to the uncomfortable closeness of shared spaces. The act of sleeping together wasn't just about warmth or space, it was about survival. People didn't just sleep next to each other, they lived next to each other. Everything was shared. food, chores, stories, and sometimes even fears. The bed, a space traditionally reserved for rest, also became a place of emotional release, where the boundaries of intimacy were blurred, where discomfort could lead to an unexpected connection. In households with children, the bed was often the center of learning, not just lessons in the usual sense, but lessons in how to survive discomfort. Children were raised alongside the knowledge that personal space was a luxury they could not afford. To be close to others, whether by choice or necessity, was a fundamental part of growing up. But the rituals of the shared bed also came with their own unique set of unwritten rules. In a crowded bed, where every inch counted, people developed unspoken manners. People learned to adjust, to shift and settle as others turned over in their sleep. There was the unvoiced agreement of how many layers of blankets could be claimed before someone else would complain, how to keep warm in a bed with too many bodies and not enough space. Sometimes the rituals were surprisingly practical. Each person would take their turn sleeping close to the wall or on the edge, allowing the others to get as comfortable as possible. If you were fortunate, you might get to lie closest to the fire, one of the only sources of warmth in a cold room. If you were unlucky, you were on the outside, with the cold air of the night creeping in as the bed creaked beneath the weight of so many bodies. Yet even in these uncomfortable positions, there was a shared understanding that sacrifice was part of life. The discomfort was not personal but communal. And then there was the safety. In a time when the world outside the bed was often filled with dangers, threats of illness, predators, or the threat of violence, the shared bed provided a sense of protection. The closeness of bodies, the warmth of breath, the faint hum of whispers in the dark, all gave a sense of belonging, a sense of being watched over in the most vulnerable space, sleep. Despite the uncomfortable proximity, the shared bed often became a place for shared stories. In the stillness of the night, when the chores were done and the fire was low, families found a kind of intimacy that went beyond just physical closeness. Stories were passed down, tales of hardship, of adventures, of the triumphs and failures that made up a life. The night was the time for connecting in ways that daytime never allowed. Parents could speak to children about the world outside, about the future, about the things they would never say during the bustle of a busy day. But this intimacy came with costs. For some, it was a constant struggle to retain their own identity and space amidst the chaos. The feeling of always being watched, of having no privacy, left some with a sense of exposure that could be draining. The emotional exhaustion of sleeplessness, of lying awake for hours while others snored or shifted, was a burden few would speak of openly. The bed was a place of intimacy, but it was also a place of loss, a loss of privacy, autonomy, and often peace. And for those who lived with strangers, lodgers, apprentices, or others who were brought into the home for various reasons, there was always the awkwardness of cohabiting with people who were not family. The closeness of the bed could quickly give way to embarrassment or tension. When personal boundaries were non-existent, the result was often a mix of frustration and acceptance. Frustration at the lack of space, at the unfamiliarity of the people beside you, but also a sense of shared responsibility, a kind of community that transcended individual discomfort. In some ways, the shared bed became a metaphor for how people lived, always together, always intertwined, bound by circumstances. And in the early hours of the morning when sleep finally came, it was the culmination of a long, tiring dance, a dance of closeness, discomfort, and survival. And yet, as you lie there, perhaps feeling the warmth of the body next to you, there's a question that lingers in the stillness of the night. What does it truly mean to be close to someone when your personal space is constantly shared with others? And how much of yourself can you give away before it starts to feel like a loss? The evolution of privacy and the rise of individualism. As the 18th century came to a close and the world shifted toward the modern age, the way people lived together in shared spaces began to change, albeit slowly. The idea of privacy, once alien and unimportant to the average person, began to take shape in the minds of thinkers, writers, and philosophers. The shift toward individualism, a hallmark of the coming Industrial Revolution, would reshape the very fabric of how people lived and how they slept. But even in the early days of this transformation, privacy wasn't just a matter of physical space. It was about control. The control of one's own time, one's own thoughts, and most of all, the ability to retreat from the world into a space that was theirs alone. This concept, so familiar to us today, was born of a world that had long been accustomed to sharing. It was in the wake of these changing ideas that private rooms began to emerge in wealthier homes, rooms with closed doors, where a person could be alone, without the pressure of sharing a bed or a space with others. Yet the idea of privacy wasn't limited to just the wealthy. As cities grew and the working class began to find more stable employment, the demand for individual spaces grew. The rise of boarding houses, with private rooms for workers, signaled the slow change toward more personalized living spaces. These rooms weren't large, and they weren't luxurious, but they offered something that was previously unimaginable to most people: the chance to close a door and be alone. The shift toward private beds, private rooms, and private lives became a symbol of the growing desire for autonomy. It was no longer enough to just be part of a communal experience. People began to value the idea of retreat, of quiet moments where they could be themselves, away from the noise and chaos of others. The shared bed, once the center of the family and the hearth, began to lose its primacy. In wealthier homes, separate bedrooms started to appear for husbands and wives, a practice that would gradually spread to the middle class. This was a revolution in itself, a revolution of intimacy and personal space, where relationships could evolve in private without the eyes and ears of the larger family or community. But this was not a simple transition. It took time, and for much of the 18th century, the shared bed remained central to family life, particularly in rural or lower-income households. However, as industrialization advanced, people started to spend more time apart, working longer hours, traveling farther from home, and eventually finding more comfortable spaces to sleep. Beds grew larger and more individual, and the need to share space with strangers diminished. The act of sleeping together, while still present in certain contexts, became less about survival and more about choice. By the end of the 19th century, sleeping alone was no longer an elite privilege. It was becoming a standard for those who could afford it. People who once slept on communal benches or in shared beds in the city were now able to claim their own personal space, even if it was modest. Yet, even with this new freedom, the very idea of shared space had shaped the way people viewed intimacy. For all the conveniences of individual rooms, there was a lingering sense of loss, the loss of that quiet closeness that was only possible when bodies were pressed together, when warmth was shared, and when sleeping next to someone else was just another part of the daily rhythm of life. And as we look back today, with the luxury of private bedrooms, full beds, and the freedom to close the door and shut out the world, we must ask ourselves, what is gained by having our own space? And what is lost when we no longer have to share the same bed, the same room, the same struggle? The art of the chamber pot, nighttime toileting through the centuries. The pot, the night, and the necessity of privacy. It's a crisp evening and the firelight dances softly across the walls of the dimly lit room. The house is quiet, save for the occasional creak of old floorboards. You've finished the day's work, but there's one more task before sleep. The chamber pot, which has sat under the bed or by the hearth all day, now comes into use for its intended purpose. The chamber pot, an object so simple and yet so essential, is one of those things we rarely think about today. But for centuries, it was an integral part of everyday life, a constant companion through the night, often hidden beneath the bed or tucked away in a corner, waiting for its moment of necessity. Its very existence reminds us of a time when privacy was a luxury few could afford, and toileting was not something done behind closed doors. In the 1700s, indoor plumbing was not yet a reality. The concept of a private, enclosed bathroom was still far from the imagination of most people. Chamber pots were not confined to one area. They were portable, often used in bedrooms, parlors, or hallways, and placed wherever privacy and convenience could be found. There were no porcelain toilets with running water, no flush systems, and no way to eliminate waste easily from the comfort of your home. Instead, the chamber pot served as an essential, yet discreet solution. It was designed to hold waste throughout the night, preventing people from having to leave their beds during the cold, dark hours. Families, particularly in urban settings, often had to make do with very limited space, and privacy was a scarce commodity. While the wealthy might have had access to private toilets or personal attendants, the poor, and even those in less privileged households, had to rely on simple objects, like the chamber pot, to keep the night functional. The use of chamber pots was often accompanied by rituals of discretion. The pot itself was usually kept out of sight during the day, often hidden beneath a bed or tucked into a wardrobe. At night, it became a necessary object of quiet utility. People didn't speak openly about its purpose. It was something that was done in the shadows, in silence. There was a certain awkwardness and embarrassment surrounding the use of the chamber pot, despite its being a universal tool in every household. The act of relieving oneself in the night was a personal task, one that was done behind closed curtains or in the dark, far from the eyes of others. Even in homes where chamber pots were used, the foul odor was a constant challenge. While there was no sewage system to whisk waste away, it was essential to maintain cleanliness around the chamber pot. People would often use herbs, potpourri, or scented oils to mask the odor. Potatoes, lemon peels, and even ashes from the hearth could be used to absorb unwanted smells. But the smell remained, a reminder of the limitations of their sanitation systems. The very use of the chamber pot marked a shift in societal structures, particularly regarding privacy. The fact that a person could relieve themselves in the comfort of their bedroom, rather than stepping outside into the cold to use a communal latrine, was seen as a significant luxury. For the wealthy, personalized chamber pots might have been used, often beautifully crafted from porcelain, and often decorated with family crests or intricate patterns. But for the poor, chamber pots were simple, utilitarian, often made from wooden, metal, or earthenware. But even as the chamber pot served its purpose, there was always the lingering question of what to do with it once it was used. At some point during the night or the following morning, the contents of the chamber pot had to be disposed of. There were no modern plumbing systems or sewage treatment plants to take away waste, so chamber pots were often emptied by the manservant, the servant, or the family member tasked with that duty. Waste was either thrown out into the street or dumped into cesspits. In cities, the dumping of waste into the streets was a major public health hazard, contributing to the spread of disease and the general dirtiness of urban life. Yet despite its unsavory nature, the chamber pot was central to daily life, especially in homes where comfort and privacy were luxuries few could afford. The chamber pot's role was not just functional, it was a symbol of practicality and necessity. As the night settled in, the household's quiet symbiosis with its chamber pot began, something both intimate and undiscussed, but ultimately part of the greater human experience. The chamber pot is a relic of an earlier time, one that's often forgotten. Today, in the age of indoor plumbing and sleek porcelain toilets, we scarcely imagine a time when such an object was essential to survival. Yet, in the dim light of the 1700s, the chamber pot was not a source of shame. It was a tool, a practical solution to the daily challenges of life. But there's a question that lingers in the stillness of the night. How much of our dignity, our privacy, and our comfort are tied to the spaces we create for ourselves? And how much do we take for granted when it's no longer necessary to hide away the things we consider most private? The public loo and the rise of sanitation. As the 18th century progressed, life in bustling cities began to change. Populations swelled and the old systems of waste management, if they could be called systems, became increasingly inadequate. The streets once passable were now filled with human waste. It wasn't just a nuisance, it was a public health crisis. In smaller villages and rural towns, chamber pots might still be the norm, but in larger urban centers, something had to change. The rise of the public latrine signaled a turning point in the history of sanitation, though it was hardly an ideal solution. The first public toilets, also called privies, appeared in some of the world's largest cities, such as London and Paris, during the late 1700s. These facilities were often basic stone or wood constructions, located in the back alleys or along main streets. They were not privileged spaces, far from it. Privacy was still a luxury for those who could afford it, but for the lower classes, these communal toilets were the only options available. In Paris, public toilets were often built above or near the Seine River, and waste would be dumped directly into the water. In London, the situation was equally grim. The streets became clogged with human waste and refuse, causing unbearable smells that hung in the air. The lack of proper sanitation contributed to the spread of diseases such as cholera and typhoid fever, claiming thousands of lives over the years. In fact, much of the early spread of diseases in cities was directly related to the poor disposal of waste. The lack of proper sewer systems made human waste a public problem, not just a private one. But for all its flaws, the rise of the public toilet marked a significant shift toward formalized sanitation, the recognition that waste could no longer be something hidden or ignored. Even if the toilets themselves were crude, often shared by dozens of people in a single day, they began to provide a means of community hygiene that was previously absent. The very act of creating a public space for waste disposal was a small revolution in the way people began to think about cleanliness and health. But the public latrine was still a far cry from the modern toilets we know today. These early toilets had no privacy. Often, you would sit next to strangers, each taking their turn, as the smell of human waste lingered in the air. The concept of hygiene was still far from what we recognize today. The toilets had no flush mechanisms. Waste simply fell into an open trench or was carried away by the nearest river or sewer system. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't safe, but it was progress in the context of its time. However, the true change came when the idea of waterborne waste systems began to take shape. In London, the first sewer systems were developed in the early 19th century, largely due to the work of pioneers like Joseph Bazalgette, whose efforts in the mid-1800s transformed the city's infrastructure. The concept of a flushing toilet, which we now take for granted, would slowly begin to evolve as these systems were expanded and refined. Even though water closets, the predecessors to modern toilets, appeared in wealthier homes in the 1700s, they were still experimental and were far from universal. The wealthy, who could afford such luxuries, began to install private toilets in their homes, complete with the first flush systems, albeit rudimentary. These were still far removed from the public toilets that the working class used, and they remained something of a novelty for the privileged few. But even in these early days, the presence of a flushable toilet, installed by hand, with complex systems of pipes and cisterns, was a sign that the future of sanitation was on the horizon. The dream of a private, hygienic restroom for all people was slowly becoming a reality. However, even with these advances, public toilets continued to exist in major cities, and they had a significant social role. These public restrooms, often located near major intersections or transport hubs, became gathering places for workers and traders. For many of the poor, these spaces were their only means of disposing of waste. But the communal nature of these toilets, open, public, shared by many, was a constant reminder of the lack of privacy available to the lower classes. And while the wealthy had begun to enjoy the benefits of private sanitation in their homes, the reality for most people was that using a public privy remained the norm well into the 19th century. The improvement of sanitation would not be fully realized for the average citizen until plumbing systems became more widespread, public health reforms took root, and cities began to embrace the science of waste management. Even with these developments, one can only imagine the relief of being able to use the restroom in private, without the risk of disease, without the discomfort of crowds. And yet, for centuries, the act of toileting had been an uncomfortable, sometimes humiliating experience that was done in dark corners or shared spaces, never with the privacy we often take for granted today. So, as we reflect on the evolution of toilets and sanitation, we must ask ourselves, how much of our modern sense of privacy and comfort is built on the sacrifices and discomforts of those who lived before us? And how much do we owe to the humble chamber pot, which marked the first step toward understanding the importance of sanitation? The quiet revolution of sanitation and the birth of modern toilets. By the 19th century, cities were beginning to realize the full scale of the public health crisis caused by poor sanitation. As populations grew, the need for better waste management became a pressing issue. The chamber pot, once a staple of everyday life, began to fade from common use, but its impact on the development of modern plumbing was profound. The humble chamber pot had, in many ways, been the first tool in the quest for cleaner living conditions, even though it was an imperfect and temporary solution. The real breakthrough came with the work of individuals like Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the chief engineer behind London's modern sewer system. In the mid-1800s, Bazalgette designed and oversaw the construction of an extensive sewer network that would help alleviate the squalid conditions in the city, particularly in the wake of the cholera outbreaks that had devastated London in 1849 and 1854. The knowledge that poor sanitation was responsible for the spread of disease led to the adoption of modern sewage systems, forever changing the landscape of urban life. Simultaneously, the invention of the flush toilet, or water closet, began to take hold. Though rudimentary versions had existed for centuries, starting with the works of John Harrington, who invented a flush toilet for Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century, it wasn't until the early 19th century that plumbing systems evolved to support flushable toilets in homes across the Western world. The availability of clean running water and the development of water treatment systems allowed for the idea of flushing waste away to become a feasible and practical reality. The water closet design was perfected over time, with innovations like the S-trap, which prevented odors from entering the home, and the cistern, which allowed for more efficient flushing. The flushing toilet became not just a symbol of status for the wealthy, but also an essential part of the future of hygiene and urban infrastructure. In cities, as the new sewage systems were built, these toilets became integral to the fight against disease and contamination. As the technology behind toilets evolved, so did the societal understanding of health and sanitation. The notion that personal waste should be out of sight, disposed of in a hygienic, sanitary manner, became central to urban planning and development. The introduction of indoor plumbing revolutionized the way people lived. Wealthy families who had once relied on the chamber pot or public latrines now had their own private toilets, a luxury that was increasingly extended to the middle class as plumbing became more widespread. Yet, as convenient as the modern toilet was, it came at a cost. With the rapid industrialization of cities and the rise of suburban development in the 19th and 20th centuries, it became clear that water consumption and the disposal of waste were not as simple as they seemed. New concerns arose about water treatment and the environmental impact of flushing away human waste. Cities began to grapple with the challenge of treating wastewater and ensuring that water supplies remained safe and clean for everyone. Today, toilets are a fundamental part of daily life in most developed nations, and the chamber pot is largely a relic of the past. Yet, the evolution from the chamber pot to the modern flush toilet represents more than just a technical achievement. It signifies a major shift in the way humans approach public health, hygiene, and individual dignity. The ability to use the restroom in privacy and comfort, without the risks of disease or discomfort, is something many of us take for granted. But as we sit on our flush toilets and appreciate the convenience of modern sanitation, we must remember that this progress was built on centuries of trial and error, on the backs of those who endured the uncomfortable realities of shared spaces, chamber pots, and public latrines. The humble chamber pot may have been a symbol of discomfort, but it was also a symbol of human ingenuity and the enduring desire for a cleaner, safer world. So, as we flush away the remnants of our meals, our discomforts, and our waste, we might take a moment to reflect on how far we've come. The modern toilet represents not just comfort, but a victory over the grime, disease, and public embarrassment of the past. And as we sit in our private spaces, the quiet question remains: what will the next generation look back on in our age and see as the inconvenience or discomfort we take for granted today?